So in the last class, we had started talking about Indian Ocean. And when we were talking about South Asia, or when we were talking about China also, we talked about certain aspects of Indian Ocean. There is an important geostrategic theater for India, for its interest. That is what we understood. And then we had seen a question from UPSC. What was that question about? Project Mausam. So I would now advise you that look at the questions of UPSC from previous years and try to form your own questions. Retain the language and fit in the subject matter that you are studying. तो एक तरीका ये भी होता है प्रिपरेशन का कि आप अपने क्वेश्चन खुद बनाने लगें, right? When whatever you have studied, try and find an equivalent question from UPSC and fit in the details, right? Now, today we are going to talk about the Indo-Pacific. So you already understand half the Indo-Pacific. ऐसा है that you understand half the Indo-Pacific? कैसे? Indian Ocean is half part of Indo-Pacific, right? Now, if you look at what we have done so far, you will start developing an understanding of the Indo-Pacific, right? So right here, we are in South Asia, and we have talked about the Indian Ocean and India's interests in the Indian Ocean. Now, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, here later we will talk about regions like West Asia, Africa. So largely you can think of these as part of the Indo-Pacific. Now at the heart of the Indo-Pacific for India lies the region called Southeast Asia. Alright, and we have already talked about certain groupings which have members from South Asia as well as Southeast Asia. ऐसी बात हम कर चुके हैं पहले, right? So now when we look at Southeast Asia, we generally see that it is governed by certain arrangements. So not specific countries, but organizations, groupings, processes which are important here. ASEAN, which is a grouping of 10 Southeast Asian countries. 10 Southeast Asian countries or states are part of ASEAN. So Indo-Pacific is a very new formulation. So thereby we try and understand it through what is already there. And then there are certain things which are called ASEAN centered institutions. Meaning at the heart of these institutions or these initiatives is ASEAN. For example, East Asia Summit. All right, you will hear about East Asia Summit in the context of Indo-Pacific as well. East Asia Summit, ASEAN centered institutions. So whenever we say ASEAN centered institution, we always remember that it has 10 countries of ASEAN plus other members, right? So for example, East Asia Summit has 10 countries of ASEAN plus 8 other countries which engage with ASEAN in a strategic dialogue. All right. So Southeast Asia coming under the umbrella of ASEAN, and then ASEAN centered institutions. Thereby we also have some other countries which may be interested in this region. So we have other important countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia. They are all part of what we can largely call the Indo-Pacific, or generally as India's approach in foreign policy is developing, we can club these countries under the Indo-Pacific as a region, right? And then you have in the distance even a partner like USA, or if you look at India, India would like Russia to also be considered an Indo-Pacific country. India always says inclusive Indo-Pacific. So India recognizes that Russia also has a Pacific coast. Russia also is a Pacific country. So you can imagine the Indo-Pacific to be this large body, and then in between India has certain engagements with smaller islands of the South Pacific, most importantly, under an initiative called FIPIC, Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation. All right, Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation. Right, let me repeat it if anyone had a difficulty. So we are talking about Indo-Pacific, and before that we understand that we have already seen that India is located in South Asia, and largely India's neighborhood is defined by Indian Ocean. And if we look at towards the west of India, we have regions like West Asia, east coast of Africa, which is part of the Indian Ocean basin, and we have organizations in the surrounding region of India like BIMSTEC, where you have membership of countries which are not from South Asia, which are also from Southeast Asia, and countries which mainly are Pacific countries, right? So BIMSTEC is one such organization where you have members of Southeast Asia. But Southeast Asia is where you see the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean meet. All right, so this is for India. Southeast Asia, the heart of Indo-Pacific. This is where Indo-Pacific conception becomes concrete. This is where Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean are meeting, right? Where if you cross the Strait of Malacca, you will reach the Pacific Ocean, right? So in this flank of India, on the eastern flank of India, you have neighbors of Southeast Asia, which generally are part of ASEAN, which is a grouping of 10 countries of Southeast Asia. And then when we start talking about this region, we start talking about ASEAN-centered institution, which simply means what? What are ASEAN-centered institution? जितना भी समझ में आए बताइए. What are ASEAN-centered institutions? ASEAN plus other countries. ASEAN-centered institutions, ASEAN-centered initiatives. So we always understand that it is about ASEAN as the main host plus other countries. For example, what is this? East Asia Summit, a strategic dialogue platform between leaders of 10 countries of ASEAN plus 8 other countries. And then you have other important countries surrounding this region: Japan, South Korea, Australia, right? Australia has a Indian Ocean coast, has a Pacific coast. Japan, South Korea are clearly countries of the North Pacific. And then on the extreme end of the Indo-Pacific lies countries like USA. Even for India, Russia is an Indo-Pacific country, though that is not highlighted, but that is geographic reality. And then in some parts of Pacific, we have smaller islands like Fiji. सुना है नाम आपने? फिजी. अभी इस साल की शुरुआत में एक आइलैंड न्यूज में था. कौन सा आइलैंड? सोलोमन आइलैंड. किस लिए न्यूज में था? लो, Tonga was in news because of a volcanic eruption. That was a fascinating event. उसके बाद लोगों ने फॉलो करना बंद कर दिया. उसके बाद शुरू हो गया रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर, right? Again, so this region we are talking about. So generally this is not in news, or if it is in news, it is forgotten. But we need to remember that India has an initiative called FIPIC, Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation. All right, Forum for India Pacific Islands Cooperation. ये है. चलिए. So this is basically how Indo-Pacific and engagements in the Indo-Pacific would look like. Now we also understand that there are certain new forms of initiatives in this region like Quad, right? Quad also is relevant in the context of the Indo-Pacific. It's a very new form of dialogue. It's not traditional like existing regional institutions like East Asia Summit or ASEAN-centered initiatives, but it is a new form of interaction, right? And all of you know, and most of you are also fascinated by Quad, but Quad is simply a dialogue platform, between India, Australia, Japan, and the United States. They define themselves as 4 democracies of the Indo-Pacific. So Quad is coming together of 4 democracies of the Indo-Pacific on the basis of shared values to engage in a dialogue. All right, coming together of 4 Indo-Pacific democracies on the basis of shared values to engage in a dialogue for exploring possibilities of cooperation in this region. That is what at this point in time Quad is. Right? Quad is not based on any kind of agreement. Quad is not based on any kind of institutionalization. There is a dialogue which started, and now that dialogue has become a regular dialogue. What would happen in the future, we don't know, but we certainly say that right now the architecture of governance in the Indo-Pacific is being formulated. We don't know what would be the future of the Indo-Pacific, but we certainly know that this region is going to be important for us. Right? When we were here, we already had talked about certain initiatives like IORA, IONS, बात की थी हमने इधर, all right, or for example Project Mosam. So they may also be, simple terms में समझ सकते हैं आप कि they may also be relevant in the context of Indo-Pacific, because for India what is happening in the Pacific, what is happening in the Indian Ocean are now linked. So here what we see is, we understood that we have policies like Sagar, we have policies like neighborhood first, है ना? So towards this region, what kind of policies have you heard of? We had to start with a policy which was called Look East to start with, and now the Look East is known as Act East. Similarly, you have now what we call development of the Indo-Pacific approach. All right, or Indo-Pacific policy in the making is what we are witnessing right now towards this particular region. Right, primarily we will find Act East as the primary policy that drove India's relations towards the East, especially focusing on Southeast Asia. But also in the era of Act East, we talk about relations with Japan, South Korea, Australia, FIPIC, right? And now Indo-Pacific approach is in the making. It would be based on existing patterns of engagements, meaning existing relations with ASEAN, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and negotiations with countries like USA. So you will see that these kinds of groupings like Quad would be important in shaping the Indo-Pacific, but they would not be the only ones. All right, because India would also try to focus on what are called ASEAN-centered institutions. Similarly, there are other groupings in this region. For example, APEC, APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation was formed in the year 1989. It has 21 members. Its headquarters is in Singapore. Secretariat is in Singapore. And India is not a member of it. China is a member of it. So APEC gives you an idea that there is a term called Asia Pacific also. So Asia Pacific is an older term as compared to Indo-Pacific, more or less denoting what today is being defined as Indo-Pacific. Earlier we used to use the term Asia Pacific, but there was one difference, that Asia Pacific was a reference to Asian countries which are in the Pacific and other Pacific countries. All right. So Asia Pacific did not include a country like India. जब हम Asia Pacific कहते हैं, India is not included. China is a large country when we talk about Asia Pacific. And Asia Pacific is a terminology that is used in the context of organizations like APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, which brought together 21 countries under one umbrella for promoting economic liberalization. It was formed in the year 1989 and its secretariat is in Singapore, right? So this was one important institution in this region of which India was not a member. And this institution also has China, US, Russia, Australia, Japan, These are the kinds of members that you will find in APEC. So एक सिंपल स्ट्रक्चर में हमने एक माइंड मैप बना लिया कि व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट इंडो पैसिफिक, व्हाट इज इट दैट वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट, व्हाट इज इट दैट वी आर थिंकिंग. और एक चीज समझ ली कि सर्टेन थिंग्स आर न्यू एंड सर्टेन थिंग्स आर ओल्ड. सो व्हाट इज ओल्ड वी नो अबाउट इट, व्हाट इज न्यू वी only keep an eye on it and we look at them from the possibility of them being a part of the process of formation of architecture of governance in the Indo-Pacific. What kind of arrangements, what kind of institutions would be here. And then there are certain agreements which are also new in origin. For example, RCEP, all right, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is simply a free trade agreement between ASEAN and 5 of its free trade partners. So again, whatever new is also happening has some element of the old. RCEP is a free trade partnership between, बताओ, ASEAN plus 5 of its free trade partners. All right. So India also negotiated this agreement, but India is not a part of this agreement right now. India did not sign it. But certainly India was interested. And then you have certain initiatives of other countries, for example, AUKUS, जिसमें आप बहुत ज़्यादा interested हो जाते हैं. AUKUS is Australia, United Kingdom, US initiative. All right, this is an agreement between these countries. AUKUS में कौन कौन है? Not Japan, but Australia, USA and UK. All right, ये AUKUS के अंदर हैं. And this is basically again what an example of what kind of activities are taking place in the Indo-Pacific. So of course RCEP is an example of economic cooperation, APEC is an example of economic cooperation, Quad is an example of strategic dialogue, East Asia Summit is an example of strategic dialogue, AUKUS is an example of a military pact between traditional military allies, all right, USA, Australia and UK. So different kinds of activities are going on, different countries have different interests, and this is something that would always be there, right? अब इसमें से इंडिया को ये ढूंढना है क्या उसके काम का है, क्या उसके काम का नहीं है, क्या वो कर सकता है, क्या वो नहीं कर सकता, और आपको भी सिंपली ये समझना है रादर देन गेटिंग ऑब्सेस्ड विद एनीथिंग, राइट? सो दिस इज बेसिकली a simple structure of what we can call the larger theater of the Indo-Pacific. All right, Indo-Pacific. Okay, tell me, क्या हुआ during the visit of the Prime Minister of Bangladesh to India? What happened? हाँ, एक एक करके प्लीज रेज योर हैंड जिसने भी पढ़ा हुआ है. और क्या हुआ? आपने पढ़ा है? बांग्लादेश was covered during that point in time. So what kind of agreements did you see? Did you see continuation of agreements on connectivity, including inland waterway, railway connectivity, है ना? उसके अलावा inauguration of Rampal. Rampal is what? Rampal में क्या है? Thermal power plant which India has partnered Bangladesh in building. यही हुआ. रिवर वाटर पे कोई मेजर एग्रीमेंट नहीं हुआ, कुशियारा पे बात शुरू की बिकॉज इट्स अ बॉर्डर रिवर, राइट? इट्स अ बॉर्डर रिवर, बट तीस्ता वॉज नॉट रिजॉल्व. बट द अंडरस्टैंडिंग इज 2011 एग्रीमेंट इज द बेसिस ऑन विच अ सॉल्यूशन कैन बी फाउंड. और क्या देखा आपने? 200 स्कॉलरशिप्स, बंगबंधु मुजीबुर रहमान scholarships were started. So now when you read it, do you get the sense कि यही हो रहा है relationship में, right? These are the areas where you need to focus upon. Was there anything on immigration? रोहिंग्या कैसे इमिग्रेशन का इशू हो गया? Acha, tell me what was there on Rohingyas? What was there on Rohingyas? So that is what we had understood in the class, that Bangladesh expects that India should help. But India said that it would be helping both Bangladesh and Myanmar as their neighbor. India can't take a side. It's not a bilateral issue between India and Bangladesh. It's a regional issue on which Bangladesh expects that India as a large and significant regional country should weigh in, should ideally provide a solution, and that solution would be putting pressure on Myanmar. India is not willing to do that, right? And then रोहिंग्या इशू एक वर्ड में सभी बोल रहे हैं, पर आपने पढ़ा उसमें क्या लिखा हुआ है? आप पढ़ें तो आपको समझ में आ जाएगा कि ये हुआ, एंड दैट इज समथिंग दैट वी हैड लर्नड इन द क्लास, राइट? इज देयर एनीथिंग न्यू दैट यू लर्नड? रिवर वाटर एग्रीमेंट, कोऑपरेशन इन डिफेंस एंड सिक्योरिटी. डिफेंस में क्या हुआ? डिफेंस में कोई मेजर एग्रीमेंट नहीं हुआ. वी एक्सपेक्ट दैट देयर शुड बी अ कॉम्प्रिहेंसिव डिफेंस एग्रीमेंट. डिफेंस में ये हुआ कि वी वुड स्टार्ट वर्किंग ऑन utilization of $500 million of line of credit that we have provided to Bangladesh for defense acquisition from India. हमसे खरीदने के लिए जो $500 million उनको दिए उसका इस्तेमाल करना शुरू करने के बारे में हमने सोचा है, राइट? Rushpa bridge making, example of connectivity, Rushpa bridge making, right? So basically I simply wanted to take an idea or get an idea that you have read it, right? ये नोट कर लिया आपने? ओके, चलिए इंडो पैसिफिक की शुरुआत करते हैं. सो लेट्स स्टार्ट विथ मैप. लेट्स स्टार्ट विद अ सिंपल मैप ऑफ इंडो पैसिफिक. आपके क्लास मटेरियल में है इंडो पैसिफिक का मैप? है, होना चाहिए, right? So this is the simplest possible map of the Indo-Pacific, right? The large region that we are talking about, with the expectation that we will understand that these are two significant geographic features in the globe, Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. So at the very simple level, what is Indo-Pacific? It's a conception that Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean are linked entities. All right, they are linked entities. So they should be seen together. They should not be treated separately. That's the simple idea, that we should treat the issues and interest in this region of the world together, opportunities as well as challenges, right? Now you will see the orientation of countries. So if you see, this is largely the Pacific theater, and this is largely the Indian Ocean theater. So you must also think that when we are imagining such large geography, we are thinking of countries and their interests. So some countries may have interest more specifically in the Pacific. Some countries may have interest more specifically in the Indian Ocean region. So it would be driven by interest-based cooperation, and countries may have primary interests in their own region, but there may be certain overlap, right? So what can be the overlap? Interests, for example, in certain regions by different countries, right? So this is Southeast Asia. India is interested in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a smaller neighbor of China. Southeast Asia also has another larger neighbor, which is Australia, right? Then Japan also is interested in Southeast Asia. Then US also is interested in Southeast Asia. US has an interest in countering Russia. US has an interest in counting China. US has a military alliance with Japan. US has a military alliance with South Korea. US has a military alliance with Australia, and US itself has a presence in this region where you have a location called Guam. Guam is an external territory of the United States. So we understand that there may be overlapping interests, There may be interest of countries which are immediately located here, and there may be interests. For example, let's say Europe. Why would Europe be interested in the Indo-Pacific? Because Europe is also engaging in trade with this region, right? So largely when this region is being defined as Indo-Pacific, countries of Europe also have started coming up with Indo-Pacific approach. So interest in Indo-Pacific is because of what is happening here. First of all, it is emerging as a geostrategic arena of competition, cooperation and contention. Geostrategic arena, meaning foreign policies of different countries are interested in this region. They are focusing in this region. So it's a geostrategic arena where you will see possibilities of cooperation, competition is there, and contention may also be there, right? So in a sense, if you are confused about the Indo-Pacific, understand that others are also confused about the Indo-Pacific, what it is, because they are in the process of defining it, right? So for example, Japan is more concerned about China as its larger neighbor. All right, China is the larger neighbor of Japan. What is the concern? They may have some territorial disputes. They have a contentious history. Now Japan is thinking, if China becomes strong, what would happen? So Japan would not like China to dominate this region. This region of what? The Pacific, where they are located. So it would like the presence of other balancing actors like the US. Similarly, this region, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia has been witness to wars and conflicts in the past. If you see, after the Second World War, this region which was called Indo-China, सुना है आपने Indo-China? There is an old term called Indo-China. यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा था? क्या हो रहा था after 1950s? You remember? क्या हो रहा था? What was happening? Vietnam War. Vietnam War was an important theater in the Cold War period, and Cold War period was about rivalry between US and Russia. उसमें चाइना ने भी थोड़ा हाथ साफ किया. All right. फिर another conflict in this region historically was the Korean conflict, North Korea, South Korea. So again, this region has been strategically significant. It has seen contention between different powers. All right. अब बस यही हुआ है कि roles change हो गए हैं, roles change हो गए हैं, right? Now you see India. India is a large country. China is its neighbor. China is a Pacific country. So India would like to safeguard its interests in the Indian Ocean region, but India has expanding interests in the Pacific. Interests like bilateral relations, interests like regional relations, interests like trade, right? And also, strategically speaking, here India can balance what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region. All right? India can strategically balance what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region. Now, if we see this particular region is dotted by small countries. If you look at their size on the map, they are smaller than China, smaller neighbors of China, smaller neighbors of India, smaller neighbors of Australia, but smaller neighbors of China particularly. So they have always relied on presence of an external actor to balance other larger powers such as China or Russia in this region. So they have always relied on the presence of external powers. Southeast Asian countries would always like some large power to be their partner in ensuring stability in this region. They would not like it to be dominated by China, right? So then different impulses are already there. So that's why you must remember that this is where one of the early alliances, आज आप NATO को जानते हैं, early alliances like SEATO was created. What is SEATO? Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. कहाँ पे था? यहाँ, US led military alliance. So it is there. So what we can say is one permanent feature of thinking about Indo-Pacific is US foreign policy. All right? US is there. Earlier, it had contention with Russia. It still has contention with Russia, but now it has contention with China. So another driver of Indo-Pacific or formulation on the Indo-Pacific can be the US foreign policy or the way it views other countries like China. It has a strategic competition with China. So strategic competition can be a driver of the Indo-Pacific, right? Strategic competition, particular interest of countries in balancing larger powers, specifically China, which is increasingly unilateral and aggressive, or strategic interest of countries like United States to balance China in its competition with China, or strategic interest of countries like India to expand their interest, expand their relations with the Pacific. So all that they can be a driver. But also you understand that if we see one of the most important regional trade agreements which has come up in these times is RCEP. There is something called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now is called CPTPP, Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. What are these? These are economic arrangements. So another way in which interest in Indo-Pacific is developing because of the economic dynamism of this region. All right, in the economic dynamism of this region. You have ASEAN economies, you have economies like Japan, South Korea, you already have US, you also have China, and now you also look at India. So what we see is generally it is said that there is a certain shift which is taking place. What is that shift? Shift from a focus at the transatlantic theater, ये है transatlantic theater, to the Pacific theater. So there has been a shift in focus in global politics from transatlantic theater to the Pacific theater. ऐसा हम मान सकते हैं. ये क्या है ट्रांसअटलांटिक थिएटर? यहाँ पे है यूएस का एक कोस्ट पैसिफिक में और यहाँ पे है यूएस का एक कोस्ट अटलांटिक में. ऑल राइट, सो ट्रांसअटलांटिक थिएटर मीनिंग फोकस ऑन relations between Atlantic countries, for example US and Europe. ये कब का फोकस था? पोस्ट सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर. मेजर फोकस रिमेन्ड हियर. क्या हुआ यहाँ पे? यू हैड फॉर्मेशन ऑफ अलायंसेस. फॉर एग्जाम्पल नेटो इज मोस्ट सिग्निफिकेंट इन द कॉन्टेक्स्ट ऑफ. नेटो का फुल फॉर्म क्या है? नॉर्थ अटलांटिक ट्रीटी ऑर्गेनाइजेशन, मीनिंग फोकसिंग ऑन transatlantic relations, US and European countries, military alliance. What is the focus? To prevent the eastward, to prevent the westward expansion of the influence of Soviet Union. यही था. So most important strategic play is taking place here, transatlantic theater. What else is happening? US has safeguarded itself from the detrimental effects of the Second World War. So it has come unscathed out of it. It has developed a significant military industrial complex. So then US is a significant economic player which is a driver of Bretton Woods conference, है ना? Bretton Woods conference, for example, एक example क्या हुआ? After the Second World War, with the Bretton Woods conference, the US dollar became world's reserve currency. US dollar which was supposed to be pegged against gold, है ना? तो एक तरह से यूएस बिकेम द रिंग मास्टर, राइट? डोंट राइट दैट टर्म, बट यूएस बिकेम द रिंग मास्टर. यूएस इज राइटिंग द रूल्स. एंड हु आर द पार्टनर्स ऑफ यूएस? मेनली द यूरोपियन कंट्रीज, राइट? सो देन यू हैव मार्शल प्लान, है यहीं पे हो रहा है. मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटीज, मार्शल प्लान, डेवलपमेंट एक्टिविटीज, राइट? यू हैव कंसोलिडेशन ऑफ यूरोपियन यूनियन एज अ इकोनॉमिक ब्लॉक. IMF, World Bank, they are led by US and European Union. WTO बाद में आया है, उससे पहले GATT था. WTO basically for the first time brought at least developing and least developed countries in negotiations. WTO बाद में आया, but traditional institutions. So the focus of power, influence, right? Strategic engagements कहाँ है ये? यहाँ यूरोप में, नॉर्थ अटलांटिक में. All right, so this is called transatlantic theater. अब हम क्या कह रहे हैं? There are important countries which are rising in this region, which is generally the East, generally the Pacific. So shift of focus has taken place. All right, a shift of focus has taken place. That is what countries are saying, that is what people are saying. So that is something which is happening. So now you see, just as in the Indian Ocean we talked about certain small island countries such as, किनके बारे में बात किया हमने, मॉरिशियस, सेशेल्स. मैप में देखो, मैप में नजर आ रहे हैं, नहीं नजर आ रहे हैं, बट स्ट्रैटेजिकली दे बिकम इंपॉर्टेंट. ये साउथ पैसिफिक है. साउथ पैसिफिक में देर आर मल्टीपल आइलैंड कंट्रीज, राइट. इफ यू नो द हिस्ट्री ऑफ सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर, यहीं पे द अलाइज एंड जापान हैड फॉट, राइट. सो नाउ we see history is repeating itself. This theater is again becoming important. So वो देश भी जो मैप में नजर नहीं आते वो important होंगे. क्यों important होंगे? Because of interest of larger countries. But still the driver of equations would be larger countries. So दुनिया को और किसी भी सब्जेक्ट को you should be able to look at it from bird's eye view, right, zoom out, and worm's eye view, right, zoom in. ये है जो एक phenomenon which is defining or driving engagements across the globe. अब यूएस इसको अपनी तरह से देख रहा होगा, इंडिया को अपनी तरह से देखना चाहिए, ऑस्ट्रेलिया अपनी तरह से देख रहा होगा, पर होता क्या है, जनरली हम चलते हैं यूएस के नैरेटिव के हिसाब से, राइट. यूएस इज वेरी गुड एट इट. तो जो यूएस कर रहा है वो आपके लिए इंपॉर्टेंट हो जाता है, जो इंडिया कर रहा है वो आपको पता नहीं होता है. सो वी आर ऑल एक्सपर्ट्स ऑफ यूएस फॉरेन पॉलिसी मेनली, एंड वी नो लेस अबाउट इंडियन फॉरेन पॉलिसी, है ना. चलिए, सो विद दिस सिंपल अंडरस्टैंडिंग, रादर देन गोइंग इनटू पर्टिकुलर्स ऑफ द मैप, अभी के लिए इतना काफी है. लेट्स स्टार्ट डेवलपिंग एन अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ व्हाट द इंडो पैसिफिक इज, एंड देन we will pick up one element of it. So this would be another large block of what we are going to do. So if you look at the Indo-Pacific, it is important to define it. What is the Indo-Pacific? Right? It is important to define it. Let's look at the form of engagement here, right. So you can define it in terms of geology and geography. So some scientists have already been looking at this region as a joint region biogeographically, in terms of existence of certain kinds of species, in terms of how land masses separated, right. And that is the scientific conception which is also there. And now we have a strategic conception that is emerging. It means, in simple terms, in the foreign policy approach of different countries, we now see an increasing preference for looking at this region as a connected region, right. So it is being defined now in terms of foreign policy approach. So that is something which is happening. Now if we see the idea of the Indo-Pacific, there are many claimants of this idea, that who came up with it. For example, Shinzo Abe came to India in 2007, gave the speech to the parliament, and he talked about confluence of two oceans, right. And he talked about how cooperation in this region. Harendra asked why India opt out of IPEF. I am not aware that India has opted out of IPEF. India has engaged. India has decided to engage with the IPEF, and IPEF is right now nothing. All right, it's nothing. It's just a proposed format of dialogue on what would be the future in this region. अभी तो शुरू हुआ है IPEF. RCEP से क्यों इंडिया ने पुल आउट किया, ये समझ लेंगे तो आप ये भी समझ लेंगे कि क्यों IPEF के कुछ एलिमेंट से इंडिया को प्रॉब्लम होगी. ऑल राइट, इंडिया को हर उस चीज़ से प्रॉब्लम होगी जहाँ पे ट्रेड के अंदर इन्वायरमेंट, लेबर स्टैंडर्ड्स, इस तरह की चीज़ों की बात आप करना शुरू करेंगे. ऑलराइट, इंडिया जनरली इज नॉट अकस्टम टू दीज काइंड्स ऑफ ट्रेड निगोसिएशंस. सो इंडिया अभी क्या कर रहा है, बात शुरू होने से पहले अपनी पोजीशन रख रहा है कि भाई इस पे बातचीत नहीं होगी. एंड आईपीएफ इज एट वेरी वेरी nascent स्टेज, वेरी वेरी nascent स्टेज. और आईपीएफ किस चीज़ का एग्जाम्पल है? अगेन यू आर टेकिंग मच इंटरेस्ट इन आईपीएफ. IPF is an American initiative. America has proposed another form of dialogue here, right? Now, Shinzo Abe talked about confluence of the two oceans. Then you have, for example, in 2012, Australia issued certain government white paper, and Australia is a truly Indo-Pacific country. It has both Indian Ocean coast and the Pacific coast. So in Australia's white paper, the term Indo-Pacific was used in terms of defining Australia's interests, right? Australia would be focusing on Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean, right? And then you have in 2017 the use of this term in certain policy speeches. For example, at that point in time, there was a Secretary of State of US, Rex Tillerson. So Rex Tillerson in his policy speech in Washington used the term Indo-Pacific, right? And then this term was used in the Trump administration, and it appeared in US documents like US National Security Strategy. So that is how you see this term, which is there in terms of understanding of geography, biogeography, is getting a new meaning in the context of how foreign policy of different countries are talking about it. So Shinzo Abe in Japan is thinking about diversifying Japan's options of partnership. And it happens when you expand the conception of the region that he is talking about. So he is talking about partnership with India. And he's talking about how India is an Indian Ocean country, Japan is a Pacific country, but ultimately it is about confluence of the two seas, two oceans, Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. They meet. So it is being driven by Japanese desire to diversify its foreign policy. It is being driven by a country like Australia, which is now defining its interests in the larger region surrounding it, Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. Indo-Pacific term is used. And then the biggest push to this idea of Indo-Pacific comes when the US starts adopting it, using it, right? You have speeches, let's say, made by Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, or when Donald Trump as US President visited China, he used the term Indo-Pacific. And then you have the adoption of this term in official documents of the US. So that is the history of it. Now, why is this happening? If this has to be defined, so we simply you will find this term that this is a new geostrategic theater. That is what some people would say. This is a new geostrategic concept. That is what some people would say, that this is new, this is emerging. That is what people are saying. Generally, this is what you can with certainty say about Indo-Pacific, that it's a new emerging geostrategic theater or concept. Why is this happening? It is happening in the context of shift in global politics. So there is certainly a shift in global politics, that in the context of which the term Indo-Pacific started getting used. Shift in global politics, shift in the locus of power and influence. Where are the most important countries in the global context? So now people would be saying that they are towards the east. So shift in locus of power and influence to east in general. That is the context in which the Indo-Pacific term is emerging. Now this shift can be seen in various forms: rise of China, rise of India, location of Japan as an important economy, Asian tigers, economies of ASEAN, and of course US would be omnipresent. It was there in the era of transatlantic engagements, it is there in the era of Indo-Pacific engagements. So that is something that is important. And then you see it is happening in the context of increasing significance of the maritime domain, that in general oceans are becoming important. Why? Because gradually you see global trade has become much more interconnected. Global economy has become much more interconnected. More and more countries are trading with each other. And WTO came up in 1995. So after the emergence of WTO, there is a certain understanding that trade has intensified. All right. So increasing significance of the maritime domain. Climate change is another reason why oceans become another area of focus, right? Generally you would see this in terms of frame of references. जब भी हम climate change के बारे में बात कर रहे होते हैं, किन मेन चीज़ों के बारे में बात कर रहे होते हैं? देखो melting of glaciers एक एग्जाम्पल हो गया, बट वी जनरली टॉक अबाउट greenhouse gas emissions causing warming, and that warming becomes a global phenomenon because it is also leading to warming of the oceans. All right, warming of the oceans, and if the oceans change, we are talking about the rise in the sea surface level. So generally किसी भी context में बात करो, trade के context में बात करो या climate change, identify any of the issues which are important. You start seeing that generally oceans have become the focus. That's why you would see even the term, fancy terms like blue economy being used a lot, है ना? So oceans have become important. Maritime domain has received a renewed significance. And then you have simultaneously emergence of countries defining their interests and developing emergence of countries defining their interests and developing capabilities to defend them beyond their respective regions. All right. So now we see also the emergence of countries who are defining their interests, not only in their immediate region, but they are defining their interests lying beyond their immediate region also. Our interest is there because our energy is coming from that region. Our interest is there because our people are going in that region. Our interest is there because our trade is flowing in that region. So countries are defining their interests. Increasing number of countries are defining their interests not only in their region where they are located, but also beyond the region in which they are located. ऐसा हो रहा है. So this then means that there are certain countries which are not only defining their interests, but they are also developing capabilities to defend these interests beyond their respective regions. So India is interested now in the Pacific towards the east, है ना? India's interests are, let's understand it with the example of India जो हम बात कर रहे थे. India's interests are expanding in the east. We have an Act East policy. We have relations with ASEAN. We have relations with Japan. We have trade flowing in that particular region. So धीरे धीरे हम अपना interest beyond South Asia, beyond Indian Ocean, we are trying to define, and then maybe the capability that we are developing may also be helpful in defending those interests. जैसे हमने विक्रांत बनाया, है ना? दूसरा, अब आपके पास obvious example है चाइना. China is not satisfied simply by remaining in its own region of the Pacific. China is defining its interest globally. So that's why China is on a spree of expansion of its influence. For example, simple example, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, goes much beyond what is China's immediate region. In some ways, you would see China also is modernizing its military. It's important in the context of its own immediate region, but it is also important in the context of its global power projection. Similarly, you have Japan, globally significant economy, right? And it would also like now to move towards developing capabilities to defend its interests beyond its region. It started with Shinzo Abe's period, when Japan started a debate on the nature of its defense forces. Australia is there, right? It wants to develop new nuclear submarines. It wants to defend or define its interests beyond its immediate surroundings. So that's why it is also talking about Indo-Pacific. Multiple countries in general, any country of any significant size gradually would define its interests beyond its own particular region, right? Simply because the world is interconnected. So these are some of the factors which are behind a certain rise of geostrategy conception of the Indo-Pacific, all right, beyond the simple geographical concept, right? Shift in global politics where locus of power and influence is shifting generally towards the east. यही हम बात कर रहे हैं पिछले 15 साल से कि this is the shift which is happening either in the context of emerging economies or in the context of India, China and these kinds of countries. Then you see increasing significance of the maritime domain. Any particular area you talk about, trade, you talk about climate change, oceans are important, of course in strategic competition also. And then you have emergence of countries defining their interests beyond their respective regions and developing capabilities to defend these interests. So that's where the concept of Indo-Pacific is coming into picture. It's becoming prominent. Now we understand that other countries have defined Indo-Pacific in their own ways. So what about India? Now India has, if you see, relations with Japan, right? Shinzo Abe passed away recently, है ना? तो बहुत interest लिया होगा आपने, because his death was unfortunately an assassination. So suddenly it became a news. But Shinzo Abe was the Prime Minister of Japan for a decade, right? Now in that period you would see India-Japan relations strengthening. आप ऑस्ट्रेलिया के बारे में भी सुनते रहते होंगे. India has a comprehensive strategic partnership with Australia. India started a 2+2 dialogue with Australia. India also has a summit level meeting with Australian prime ministers, right? And then US. India has a comprehensive global strategic partnership with the United States. है ऐसा? All of them are important partners of India. And then all of them may also have, they have their own relations, all of them may also have their own equations or problems with China. So China is also there in the backdrop. All of them are interested in, worried about, alarmed by the rise of China and what would China do. So then in the engagement with these countries, with Japan or with US, with Australia, you see an exploration of the idea that India is also an important part of the Indo-Pacific. So first of all, we see a shift from Asia-Pacific. Asia-Pacific is a term that China prefers. China prefers the old term Asia-Pacific. All right. So Asia-Pacific does not have India, but India's partnership is there with Pacific countries, Australia, Japan and United States. So now how do you define common geography? So then gradually these countries started saying that India is an important country in the Indian Ocean region. India can be a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region, right? And then gradually what you would see is this idea got traction in India as well. As it became fashionable globally, India also responded. So in 2018, anyone who wants to understand continuity and change in foreign policy should go and read the speech of the Prime Minister, Shangri-La Dialogue. Shangri-La Dialogue takes place at Singapore. All right. In Singapore, it's an annual dialogue. And this is where important military functionaries, defense ministers, prime ministers gather and express their views or the views of their country on strategic issues in the region. Shangri-La Dialogue. So 2018 Shangri-La Dialogue, Prime Minister Modi gave a keynote address. All right. And in that, for the first time, he outlined India's approach on the Indo-Pacific. What is Indo-Pacific for India? Right? So earlier others are saying that Indo-Pacific is there, India is an important country in the Indo-Pacific. We are happy whenever somebody says we are important. But then it became important for us also to define what is Indo-Pacific. So हमने भी अपना एक idea दे दिया. What is the idea? First of all, it is based on geography. Right? That for India, the concept of Indo-Pacific is based on the geographic realities. What is the geographic reality? Simply that Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean are linked. Right? And there is a vast array of opportunities and challenges in this region. Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean are connected, and in this larger region there is a vast array of opportunities and challenges. Right? So why should we talk about this region? Because multiple countries are located here, multiple interests are here. So there are opportunities and challenges that should be dealt with jointly because these oceans are connected. Then India says Southeast Asia. Or if we see countries of ASEAN, in other words, is at the heart of Indo-Pacific. So India says that geographically and civilizationally, countries of Southeast Asia connect the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So for India, ASEAN is central to Indo-Pacific. So that is why you would see commonly the term like ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality is an important feature of India's conception of the Indo-Pacific. So India is anchoring cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in ASEAN and ASEAN centered institution. So second feature of India's definition of Indo-Pacific is that the countries of Southeast Asia civilizationally as well as geographically connect the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So thereby Southeast Asia, ASEAN, ASEAN centered institutions should be at the heart of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. This is what is called ASEAN centrality in India's approach to Indo-Pacific. Right? And then India says that a Indo-Pacific is not a club of limited numbers, nor is it defined by strategic competition. So thereby now India is giving its normative view, a message to both China and US. क्या भाई देखो आपका अपना होगा झगड़ा, but this is not what defines Indo-Pacific. What defines Indo-Pacific? So पहले हमने positive conception दिया, फिर हमने कहा नेति. What is it not? Right? So it is not a club of limited number to be dominated, nor is it defined by स्ट्रैटेजिक कंपटीशन, ऐसा इंडिया ने कहा. सो ये एक फीचर है, यानी कि देयर इज ऑलवेज अंडरस्टैंड अ स्कोप फॉर डिफरिंग विथ इवन कंट्रीज विच आर फ्रेंडली. यूएस की फॉरेन पॉलिसी इंडिया की फॉरेन पॉलिसी नहीं हो सकती है, इवन दो इंडिया एंड यूएस कैन बी फ्रेंड्स in certain circumstances, and if possible India would also like to be friends with China. All right, so that is what we are saying here. So we are telling others what to do, what not to do. So don't make it a strategic theater of competition. So thereby we can say that India's conception of the Indo-Pacific is a positive one, and multi-faceted. It is based on the advocacy of certain important principles. It is based on the advocacy of certain important principles. All right. So India's conception of the Indo-Pacific is a positive one and multifaceted, based on multiple factors, not a single factor. It is based on the advocacy of certain important principles. What are these principles? What is it that India argues? Right? So these principles are arguing in favor of certain rights of the countries, that it should be ensured that countries have freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, freedom of unimpeded lawful commerce, which means what? That if ships are moving through this region, they should be able to move unhindered, freedom of navigation. If flights are moving through this region, they should be able to move unhindered, unimpeded lawful commerce. If countries are engaging in lawful commerce, that should not be impeded by the policy of any other country, unimpeded lawful commerce. And thereby, in the long term, India stands in favor of ये टर्म आपने काफी सुना होगा, फ्री, ओपन, inclusive and a rules based order in the Indo-Pacific. What is it that India stands for? फ्री, मतलब वो फ्रीडम्स की बात जब हम कर रहे हैं, ओपन, इंक्लूसिव, मतलब किसी को भी एक्सक्लूड करने की बात नहीं कर रहे हैं, एंड अ रूल्स बेस्ड ऑर्डर. सुना है आपने? रूल्स बेस्ड ऑर्डर इन द इंडो पैसिफिक. दैट इज व्हाट इंडिया टॉक्स अबाउट. दैट इज हाउ वी डिफाइंड द इंडो पैसिफिक. समझ में आ गई आपको बात? समझ में आ गई बात या कोई डाउट है? सो व्हाट इज, इफ समबडी सेज व्हाट इज इंडियाज व्यू ऑन इंडो पैसिफिक, यू वुड बी एबल टू आंसर. आंसर देते समय जब बोल रहे हो तो एक आदत डालने, टू थिंक एंड टू से फर्स्टली, सेकेंडली, थर्डली, मोर ओवर, है ना, रादर देन एक शब्द पे आपने शुरू कर दिया. आप जनरली जब कुछ भी पूछो आपका आंसर क्या होता है? एक वर्ड का आंसर होता है, वन वर्ड आंसर. थिंक एंड देन ट्राई टू स्पीक क्योंकि कभी ना कभी इंटरव्यू देना भी है ना. तो दिस इज बेसिकली व्हाट इंडियाज कॉन्सेप्शन ऑफ द इंडो पैसिफिक इज. अगर आपको कोई गलत फहमी थी और अगर आपको कोई डाउट है या अगर आपका इंटरेस्ट है, इफ यू आर इंटरेस्टेड और इफ यू हैव एनी डाउट्स, as I have suggested, you can read what Prime Minister's keynote address to the Shangri-La Dialogue 2018. And I generally would encourage you कि कुछ ना कुछ तो पढ़ना होता है, तो एक बार ये पढ़ लो, क्या लिखा हुआ है इसके अंदर देख लो जरा, राइट. So that would give you an idea of much in India's foreign policy today, and it will give you an idea of how foreign policy is mostly about continuity, but factors like geography, geostrategic orientation may change, and thereby we need new formulation from time to time. So then if we see what is it that India India has done to give a concrete shape to this idea. So you will find that India created in its Ministry of External Affairs an Indo-Pacific division. So it reorganized territorial divisions in Ministry of External Affairs. It created an Indo-Pacific division to provide a unified policy approach and leadership to its Indo-Pacific policy. Then we see that India endorsed ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. (2019) ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which also talked about ASEAN centrality in the Indo-Pacific. Then you see India announced initiatives based on Indo-Pacific. So for example, India announced a non-binding, non-treaty based conception of Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It is a formula that India has proposed for cooperation in this region, that areas like maritime security or disaster relief or development of blue economy, prevention of pollution, etc., they can be dealt by countries collectively. So India has offered a framework of cooperation, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. ये हमने announce किया in 2019, right? And then you have dialogues with other countries. So at the collective level, you have a dialogue like Quad, which we were earlier participating in, we continue to participate in it. And then we have dialogues with our partners in this region, right? So we have dialogues like ASEAN, India-ASEAN Summit, where we discuss these kinds of issues. We have dialogues with Japan, Australia, but not only them, USA, but not only USA, France, where conception of Indo-Pacific figures prominently, cooperation in the Indo-Pacific figures prominently. So that is what we did. We first defined what Indo-Pacific is for us, and then we created an Indo-Pacific division where in the MEA, Ministry of External Affairs, and then we started cooperating on the basis of the idea of Indo-Pacific. So we endorsed ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific in 2019, right? So we say that we support ASEAN to be central in the developments of institutions in the Indo-Pacific, and then we announced our own initiative at a dialogue at ASEAN, which we called Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It's non-binding, it's not treaty based, so it gives a formula for cooperation. It is based on what can be called 7 pillars of cooperation. Pillars like maritime security, as I said, or humanitarian assistance, disaster relief. So India says that countries of this region should start cooperating, where not necessarily in any controversial area, but areas which may be significant for the oceans. So some steps have been taken, and then what we see, generally the progress in understanding or developing an understanding of the Indo-Pacific or developing cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is happening through dialogues. For example, Quad is a dialogue which is relevant in the context of Indo-Pacific. But in our relations with Japan also we have a focus. Every year you will see any joint statement between India and Japan would generally include a line on both India and Japan stand for a free, open, inclusive and rules based order in the Indo-Pacific. तो अब बात करते हैं तो एक पॉइंटर ये बन गया है किसी भी रिलेशन में, जापान, ऑस्ट्रेलिया, यूएसए, बट वी ऑल्सो विथ फ्रांस we have started talking about the Indo-Pacific, and that is basically what we are doing in the context of this particular region. Now generally we say that this is an emerging arena where there are certain challenges. What are the challenges? Lack of a distinctly common conception of Indo-Pacific. So we have a broad conception of Indo-Pacific, but what specifically does it mean is still not clear. All right, it is still to be understood what would it mean, what form of cooperation would be there. Largely this term is seen in the context of strategic competition. So no matter what you do, what would attract the attention is strategic competition defines much of the focus. ये एक लिमिटेशन है इंडो पैसिफिक का कि नो मैटर व्हाट यू डू, स्ट्रैटेजिक competition is the defining feature, right? So why are you interested in the Indo-Pacific? Because Indo-Pacific can be seen as a counter to China. यही आइडिया है ना, बेसिक आइडिया यही होता है. So ये एक वीकनेस है इंडो-पैसिफिक का, right? Then the lack of, and this can be related with the first point also, lack of any agreement or organization, lack of any agreement or organization defining the Indo-Pacific. So Indo-Pacific is like the केव एलिगरी, ऑल राइट. या आपने वो कहानी सुनी होगी कि कुछ विद्वान लोग जो देख नहीं सकते हैं, राइट, सर्टन blind wise people are touching an elephant from all sides, and then they are asked a question, what is this? So whosoever is touching the trunk defines the elephant to be the trunk, whosoever is touching the tail defines the elephant to be the tail, whosoever is touching the legs is defining the elephant to be the legs. But ultimately they are all talking about the elephant. But if you ask them what is the elephant, they would define it differently. So generally ये एक आइडिया है जो आपको मदद कर सकता है ये समझने में. Indo-Pacific is not a single thing, not a single idea, right? And that's its limitation. Lack of any agreement or organization defining the Indo-Pacific. ऐसा कोई agreement नहीं है, ऐसा कोई institution नहीं है जो Indo-Pacific को define करता हो या ये कहता हो कि ये देश Indo-Pacific के आपस में cooperation करेंगे. These countries of Indo-Pacific would cooperate together. So generally you will see the development of Indo-Pacific and cooperation in Indo-Pacific in silos based on the preference of countries, based on certain kinds of dialogues, all right? And then certainly it's a question of India's capability or capabilities in defining cooperation in the Indo-Pacific are limited. So we are not militarily a defining power, we are not economically a defining power right now. So that's something that we need to understand. So that's why we would pick and choose what kind of cooperation would we like, what would kind of cooperation would suit us, right? But these would generally remain the limitations of the Indo-Pacific. What? Lack of a distinctly common conception of Indo-Pacific, which means there may be specific differences on specifics of it, right? There may be a general commonality of understanding that this is what Indo-Pacific means to us, but there may still remain specific differences in terms of what do you want to do. Strategic competition defines much of the focus. No matter what you do, how people understand Indo-Pacific, simply in terms of strategic competition between China and United States. So if you ask Russia or China, they would say that Indo-Pacific is nothing but a divisive policy of US. US is dividing the countries of Asia. All right. एंड कॉमन कंसेप्शन भी यही, आप भी पूछे तो इंडो पैसिफिक आपको ऐसे ही नजर आता है, चाइना है, कंपटीशन है. सो दैट इज द लिमिटिंग फीचर. एंड देन लैक ऑफ एनी एग्रीमेंट और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन डिफाइनिंग द इंडो पैसिफिक. सो ये सिंपल पॉइंट है. एंड देन इफ यू लुक एट इंडिया फ्रॉम आवर पर्सपेक्टिव, आर कैपेबिलिटीज एंड डिफाइनिंग कोऑपरेशन इन द इंडो पैसिफिक आर लिमिटेड right now. So these are all the things that one needs to work on to take advantage of the opportunities in the Indo-Pacific and deal with the challenges. So what should be done? India needs to define its approach, and this can be done by developing a comprehensive maritime policy. Number one, that is what we need to define. We already have Sagar. Sagar defines our approach mainly towards the Indian Ocean region. We need to now build a Sagar for the larger Indo-Pacific. So we need to define who we are, what do we want, right? What is going to be our specific approach towards this region? India needs to define its approach, and India needs to develop a comprehensive maritime policy. In the Indo-Pacific, the attempt should be that cooperation should be driven by important regional powers, right? So important regional powers, for example, India, Indonesia, Australia, rather than simply relying on larger powers like US. These countries which are immediately located in this region should drive cooperation, right? So it should be multipolar form of cooperation. ये करने की जरूरत है, right? And then we need to focus on where easiest progress can be made, non-controversial areas of cooperation, provide adequate opportunities. Non-controversial areas of cooperation provide adequate opportunities to develop engagements in the Indo-Pacific. So where should be the focus and where is the focus? So if you see, some areas cooperation would be easier. So for example, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, search and rescue. In these kinds of areas, you will see maritime security, right? In these kinds of areas, generally, it would be easier to develop cooperation. So, countries should define the agenda. For example, India has proposed the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. So, that is something that should happen first. Countries should develop trust and countries should engage with each other. And then, security concerns in the region. Security concerns in the region need to be factored in. Security concerns in the region need to be factored in. So when you are thinking about Indo-Pacific, largely cooperation in the non-controversial areas would be useful, but you cannot ignore security concerns in this region, which would affect cooperation. What kind of security concerns? For example, developments in Myanmar. Myanmar faces an insurgency, right? Or issues in South China Sea, right? Or generally issues of strategic competition or issues like terrorism. How do you deal with them collectively? So that is something that would require development of a common approach. But in simple terms, we understand that in some areas cooperation would be easier, in some areas cooperation would be difficult to find, right? And ultimately, what should India do? Apart from developing a comprehensive maritime approach and professing these kinds of cooperation, India should enhance its capabilities. That's number one. And continue bilateral as well as multilateral engagements, bilateral as well as multilateral engagements in the region. So simultaneously work on your capacity building, work with other countries which may be relevant, work at multilateral platform. That is basically generally what India's options are. Working with others would help you in building your capability. Others would work with you only when you have capabilities. Alright, and working multilaterally means you are helping in the development of rules of engagement in this particular region. समझ में आ गई अब आपको बात? So आप एक छोटा सा क्वेश्चन आंसर कर सकते हैं. Right, all people are helping each other online in terms of spellings. That helps me as well, right? Till I improve my handwriting, cooperative, collaborative action is the solution. Good. Chaliye. Adishwar says, with so many members in its ambient having different interests, with different times make difficult to come on the same table. Can this be an issue? Yes, we have identified this to be an issue. Common definition नहीं होगा, specific interest match नहीं करेंगे. So even the countries you think are friends may not be friendly on all the issues, right? So जैसा मैंने कहा था, अगर आप confused feel करें इंडो पैसिफिक में, तो चिंता मत करें, you are not alone. Even the most important countries are right now confused, right? They are trying to define क्या करें यहाँ पे. एक कॉमन फैक्टर है the rise of China, which is a strategic factor which generally may be common among different countries. But don't forget that this is not the only factor. Economy है, generally maritime domain है, और generally इंडिया के conception में आप देखोगे इस तरह की चीज़ों पे ज़्यादा बातें हैं. हम चाइना के बारे में बात नहीं करते हैं जब हम इंडो पैसिफिक के बारे में बात कर रहे होते हैं. वी डोंट ओपनली टॉक अबाउट चाइना. ज़्यादा हम क्या कहते हैं, जैसा हमने कहा, इट्स नॉट अ क्लब ऑफ लिमिटेड नंबर, इट्स नॉट फॉर स्ट्रैटेजिक कॉम्पिटिशन, राइट? ऐसी बात हमने कही. यहाँ पे आप लीजिए ब्रेक के बाद वी कंटिन्यू विद द इंडो पैसिफिक. द क्वेश्चन इज Define the term Indo-Pacific with a special reference to. Define the term Indo-Pacific with a special reference to India. Define the term Indo-Pacific with a special reference to India. With a special reference to India. Also identify the steps taken by India. Also identify the steps taken by India to develop engagements in this context. Also identify the steps taken by India to develop engagements in this context. All right, and suggest measures guiding the approach towards this region, and suggest measures guiding the approach towards this region in the future, and suggest measures guiding the approach towards this region in the future. Right, 3 express parts have been given. Let's see how much of justice you can do with it. Right, abhi likhna chahenge? Would you like to write now? लिखना चाहेंगे? Please show of hand how many of you would like to write. मेजॉरिटी है कि माइनॉरिटी है? माइनॉरिटी है। क्यों, बाकी लोगों को लिखने में क्या प्रॉब्लम है? हाँ, नहीं, घर से तो लिख के लाते हैं आप, घर से लिख के भी बहुत परफेक्ट आंसर नहीं लाते, तो यहीं पे इम्परफेक्ट लिख लो। चलिए, टेक अ ब्रेक। इफ द मेजॉरिटी डजंट वांट टू राइट, आई वोंट फोर्स यू टू, बट आई होप दैट यू विल गो एंड राइट। ठीक है, चलिए, हियर इज अ ब्रेक। आफ्टर द ब्रेक वी कंटिन्यू इन दिस रीजन। ओके, लेट्स गेट स्टार्टेड। Let's get started. Now, we were talking about Indo-Pacific, so we developed a simplest understanding of the larger region that we are talking about, and generally understand that this is a new emerging conception. All right, new and emerging conception of a region. So we will keep on seeing addition to the understanding through agreements, through engagements, and generally we have created a picture of what kind of region are we talking about. What is it that India is doing in this particular region? Question दिखाई आपने लिखा? क्या question है? Somebody missed out the question online. Yogesh, the question is, define the term Indo-Pacific with special reference to India. Also identify the steps taken by India to develop engagements in this context and suggest measures guiding the approach to this region in the future. This is the question, to give you an idea that there is something that we know and there are many things that we don't know about this region as yet. Right? Adishwar asks a question online. As China is our neighbor and that too of many other in Indo-Pacific, should we not change our mentality of looking its growth as a challenge rather than getting in talks on how its growth can help in development of the region? Is involving USA all the time in our regional bloc important? So first of all, talking about India changing its approach also depends on whether China changes its approach, right? So India always says that engagements should be promoted, dialogue should be promoted, but other countries should not harm our interests. So if China, simple answer to your question is, if China adheres to the 3 mutuals that India has articulated, identified, then India would be willing to cooperate with China in all the regions, and that has been India's approach, right? Is involving USA all the time in our regional bloc important? No, it is not important. So that's why India does not have only engagements with US. But India, if you see, in the context of Indo-Pacific, if you have noticed, India says ASEAN centrality, that what is central to cooperation in this region? ASEAN.
ASEAN-led institutions. India is not saying US, but US is also a strategic partner. So we are not blind to strategic realities. So we engage with it as well. But certainly India would not feel that in every initiative there should be US. ऐसा नहीं है. All right, and with China, as we say, 3 mutuals. If they are adhered to, well, India is willing to cooperate with China, right? So let's now start talking about one by one some of the important relations that India has in this region, starting with countries of South East Asia. We defined the region as expansively as possible, and now we open it up in its blocks. So generally understand Southeast Asia, the relations are talked in the context of ASEAN as a block of 10 members. All right, 10 members. So ASEAN is a regional grouping that goes back to 1967, and it's a regional organization comprising 10 countries of Southeast Asia. Its headquarters is in Bangkok, and if you look at it, its collective population is more than 650 million. That's why it becomes important, 650 million people. And then their collective economies, if you combine their economies, that is also around 2.5 trillion US dollars. So this should give you an idea why it makes sense to talk about ASEAN rather than single countries of Southeast Asia, right? You may get a sense that it is a significant economic bloc. If you look at the cumulative size of their economies, it's important demographically. And ASEAN comprises countries which are geostrategically significant, meaning this is a region which sits right at the cusp of confluence of Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So that's why you would see historic interest in this region has always been there, right? So China as a large neighbor, US as a strategic actor has been present in this region. And then in this context you also have countries like India. So India shares border with Myanmar on the land, and India shares borders with countries like Thailand and Indonesia in the maritime domain. So India is also a neighbor, but is not a large neighbor like China. So a large neighbor like China would be seen as a dominating player, and US has been a strategic actor present in this region, either fighting Vietnam War or defending its own self-defined interests. So US is also a friend, but again this is a friend which is a large and powerful friend, right? And here comes India. India is also a neighbor, but India has certain distinct qualities. What are these distinct qualities? Shared cultural and civilizational affinity with Southeast Asia. All right. India is seen generally as a benign power. All right. India is seen as a benign power, right? So these countries may be comfortable in dealing with India because India has sufficient size, India has sufficient capabilities, and India has cultural similarities with these countries, and India is seen to be benign, not a dominating neighbor like China, neither a large military power like US, which generally would be interested in defending its own interests, right? So geostrategically significant region, significant in terms of economy, significant in terms of people. So after China and India, this is the largest concentration of workforce anywhere in the world. All right. So you start then noticing the importance of these countries. Why would India be interested in these countries. So let's look at the map. Let's look at the map of this particular region. Now, sufficiently visible है सबको? Okay. Let's look at from as close as possible to India, right? So this is Myanmar. Myanmar is a Southeast Asian country and India shares a border with Myanmar. All right. So Myanmar is called India's gateway to Southeast Asia. Myanmar may be important both in the context of neighborhood first as well as India's Act East policy. All right. So this is the river Irrawaddy, as we have noted. The river Irrawaddy originates in China and flows through Myanmar. If you see, neatly dividing Myanmar in equal parts, right? So that is a geographical feature. This is the river called Salween. All right. This is Myanmar. Then it flows through Myanmar, Thailand border, flows into China. So it originates in China, then Myanmar, flows through the border of Thailand and Myanmar, and then it also empties into the Indian Ocean. All right. So these are two important rivers, Salween and Irrawaddy. And generally, see, this is one region from which UPSC asks location-based questions. A lot of location-based questions are asked from this region, right? From this particular region. Now, you see another feature of this region. What is this particular river? Mekong. So we have already made a note on Mekong, the countries through which it flows. किया है हमने पहले. So अपने atlas में भी आप कर लीजिएगा. Now, it gives you one idea that countries of Southeast Asia are both continental neighbors of India. Myanmar is a continental neighbor as well as maritime neighbors of India. Similarly, another idea, we have a conception of what can be called continental Southeast Asia. So this is continental Southeast Asia, meaning the landmass. All right. And we have maritime Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, which is largely island region. All right, which is largely island region, right? So continental Southeast Asia and maritime Southeast Asia. ऐसे generally दो aspects में Southeast Asia को देख सकते हैं. So which gives you a simple idea that suppose let's say you start in India's northeast and start building a road. Myanmar, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, right? So it's quite possible to have a rail network, have a road network which gives India a reach, seamless reach till South China Sea if we have better connectivity with Southeast Asian countries. Continental Southeast Asia generally gives India a continuation on the land till the Pacific. So India may not be a Pacific country, but if it has better relations with Southeast Asia, it can have seamless connectivity till the Pacific by continental Southeast Asia. समझ गए आप इस बात को? दूसरा, when we are looking at maritime domain, Indian Ocean is where India defines its interests, and this is Strait of Malacca, and then Strait of Malacca we cross into South China Sea, right? But then you see India may be of interest because it has a significant territory located here, Andaman and Nicobar Islands, which provides India power projection capability relevant to these countries also, close to these countries also. And if we have cooperation with, let's say, countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, right, we become relevant in the maritime domain in Southeast Asia as well. With better maritime connectivity, better maritime cooperation, we can become a relevant power in the Pacific as well. तो ये याद रखेंगे. दूसरा यूपीएससी एक तरह का बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग सवाल पूछता है जिसमें कभी कभी आपको दिमाग लगाना पड़ता है, बट दैट्स अ वेरी इजी क्वेश्चन. यूपीएससी आस्क ईस्ट टू वेस्ट अरेंज करो, राइट, नॉर्थ टू साउथ. So it gave a question a few years back, and it gave you a list of Southeast Asian capitals, and the question was about which is the northernmost, which is the southernmost of the capitals. So here are the capitals of Southeast Asian countries. Naypyidaw is the capital of Myanmar. All right. Next country, Vietnam. Next country, Thailand. Bangkok is the capital of Thailand. This is Laos. Vientiane is the capital of Laos. This is Cambodia. What is the capital of Cambodia? Phnom Penh. This is Vietnam. The capital of Vietnam is Hanoi. This is the Malay Peninsula. So Malaysia. So Malaysia has two territorial zones, one on the Borneo Island and another on what is called the Malay Peninsula. So capital of Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur. And then this is Singapore. All right. Capital of Singapore is Singapore city. And then this is Jakarta, capital of Indonesia. And then another country which remains to be talked about is Manila. This is the capital of Philippines. So generally this is considered to be Southeast Asia. Now there is a very small and new country which is called East Timor. ईस्ट तिमोर की कैपिटल क्या है? दिल्ली, राइट. सो अगर ईस्ट तिमोर भूल जाओ, अगर कोई आपसे सिंपली पूछे व्हाट इज द सदर्न मोस्ट कैपिटल इन साउथ ईस्ट एशिया, व्हाट इज द आंसर? मैंने कहा ईस्ट तिमोर भूल जाओ, क्वेश्चन में ये भी ध्यान देना है. व्हाट इज द सदर्न मोस्ट कैपिटल इन साउथ ईस्ट एशिया? जकार्ता. व्हाट इज द नॉर्दर्न मोस्ट कैपिटल? हनोई, राइट. सो सब याद रखने की जरूरत नहीं है. If you knew the southernmost or if you knew the northernmost, you could have answered that question, right? Now एक exercise आप खुद से करेंगे. क्या exercise करेंगे? You will follow the tropics. कौन सा tropics? Tropic of Cancer. And then और क्या है यहाँ पे? और क्या है यहाँ पे? Equator. So you will follow the equator on your map. In your atlas, ये आदत डालने, इक्वेटर को फॉलो करें. Where is it passing through, right? So generally what we find is continental Southeast Asia is north of the equator, all right, and maritime Southeast Asia crisscrosses across the equator, both regions in south of the equator and north of the equator. For example, Philippines is located entirely north of the equator. Parts of Indonesia located south of the equator. All right. So that is basically one simple idea of this region that you can take. Now some of the other geographical features, right? So this is the Andaman Sea, which you should all be aware of. This is the Gulf of Thailand. So Gulf of Thailand is located in the Pacific. It's a marginal sea of the Pacific. Strait of Malacca. Strait of Malacca everybody knows. We have talked about it enough, right? Strait of Malacca is between Malay Peninsula, समझ में आ गया आपको? Malaysia and Sumatra of Indonesia. बहुत आसान है, right? And at the tip of the Strait of Malacca is Singapore. This is Singapore. इसको आप मैप में आसानी से देख भी नहीं पाएंगे. Then there is another strait here. This is the Sunda Strait. Sunda Strait is between Java and Sumatra. Is Sumatra world's largest archipelagic country? Is Indonesia world's largest archipelagic country? Biggest archipelago is Sumatra, world's largest or biggest archipelago? नहीं? हाँ, हवाई. चलिए आप देख लीजिएगा. लेकिन इंडोनेशिया के बारे में सिंपली ये याद रखें, एक द लार्जेस्ट आइलैंड इन Indonesia is Sumatra. Then you have Java, some of the main islands. And then a very well-known island is Bali. All right. And then आप आगे भी जा सकते हैं, लेकिन here is Borneo, right? But Borneo is not completely in Indonesia. Borneo has 3 countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, and the tip of it. Can you name the country? Brunei. All right, this is Brunei. तो ब्रुनई की कैपिटल के बारे में बात किया था हमने. ब्रुनई की कैपिटल क्या है? बंदर सेरी बेगावान. ऑल राइट, तो ये हो गया. नाउ दी Sunda Strait, so that is an important strait, right? And then what is this? What is this? कारीमाता स्ट्रेट. सुना है आपने? सुना है? कारीमाता स्ट्रेट किसके बीच में है? इंडोनेशिया के 2 आइलैंड्स के बीच में है ना? सो बेसिकली इट डिवाइड्स Indonesia, the Borneo possessions of Indonesia, largely with the Sumatran possessions of Indonesia, right? And of course, this is the Java Sea. Java Sea is between Java and Borneo. So UPSC क्या कह रहा है आपसे? Simply be aware. It is not going to ask you very difficult question. It asks you very simple questions on the basis of awareness, right? Now, the island of Sulawesi. So सिंपल मेजर फीचर्स पे आप नज़र रखें इस जगह पे. और फिर एक जो रीजन है जो कि बहुत ज़्यादा न्यूज़ में रहता है वो है साउथ चाइना सी. सो जनरली सी साउथ चाइना इज सराउंडेड बाय चाइना ऑन द नॉर्थ एंड देन टुवर्ड्स द वेस्ट, टुवर्ड्स द ईस्ट एंड टुवर्ड्स द साउथ यू हैव कंट्रीज ऑफ साउथ ईस्ट एशिया. सो इट इज सराउंडेड बाय चाइना and countries of Southeast Asia. So बहुत सारी चीजें हैं यहाँ पे, but 2 major features of South China Sea are Spratly Islands. Spratly Islands, simply remember, are located in South China Sea, and the other major feature of South China Sea is Paracel Islands. So these are 2 major features which are in news or contested, and they are located in South China Sea. Now South China Sea is interesting because China claims entirety of South China Sea for itself, right? It has an idea called 9 dash line. So it says entirety of South China Sea belongs to me. Now countries like Vietnam or countries like Malaysia, countries like Indonesia, countries like Philippines oppose this idea. So this region is in news because of the contention on these features, Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, but also the entirety of South China Sea. But why else is this important? Because if you see trade flowing from east to west and west to east, from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean and Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, passes through South China Sea. So it is not only regionally important, but it is important because of presence of important sea lanes of communication. So if China says that entirety of this belongs to me, it means it is creating a hurdle to freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight. It is endangering lawful unimpeded commerce. So इसलिए ये globally important हो जाता है. अगर ये कहीं और होता तो कोई बात नहीं, but this is right smack in the middle of global trade routes, and any conflict in this particular region is going to affect global trade. So that's why it is a region surrounded by Southeast Asia and China, but it is globally important. तो अगर चाइना कहता है ये पूरा का पूरा हमारा है, तो दुनिया भर के लोग कहेंगे कि ऐसे कैसे. फॉर एग्जाम्पल 50% ऑफ इंडियाज ट्रेड इज थ्रू दिस रीजन. 50% of India's trade is flowing through this region. For example, $5 trillion of global trade is flowing through this region. So that's why this has become globally significant. But 2 major contenders ये कौन है? या तो चाइना या countries of Southeast Asia. So what China would be doing would be of interest to other countries, but would be of most interest, immediate interest to these countries, right? And then these countries are smaller neighbors of China, so they may not be able to contain China on their own. So thereby there is always a possibility of India's strategic role or the strategic role of the US in this particular region. So before the Ukraine crisis, this was considered to be the place where the next war would start. ऐसा पिछले कई सालों से हम सुन रहे थे कि tensions are heating up in this region on the issue of possession of Paracel Islands, Spratly Islands, or whatever China is doing. We look at it as an issue, and that's why here there is most possibility of the tensions, right? अभी तक ऐसा हुआ नहीं, यूक्रेन में वॉर पहले हो गई. So that is basically a reminder that you cannot predict things, but you can understand that this region is important, right? Let's move forward. Let's do the main job. So we understand Southeast Asia is geostrategically significant, and India is a neighbor in terms of sharing land border with Myanmar and a maritime boundary with Thailand and Indonesia, right? Now when we see these relations, what are these relations based on? These relations are based on age-old cultural and civilizational ties. All right, cultural and civilizational ties with these countries. Now, we also understand that currently commerce, which is trade, is also important. And we see that there are certain new and emerging areas which have become important. So in simple terms, some people would say that India's relations with Southeast Asia is based on the pillar of 3 C's. All right, culture, commerce and connectivity. ये सिंपल फॉर्मूला हो गया. दैट अगर कुछ ध्यान नहीं आ रहा तो आप क्या याद रखेंगे? कल्चर, कॉमर्स एंड कनेक्टिविटी, विच सिंपली मीन्स cultural civilizational ties, economic engagements, new and emerging areas of cooperation, and it also means that there is a larger strategic basis of engagement. So these are simple ways in which you can understand the engagement between India and Southeast Asia. Now cultural and civilizational ties, easier to understand kaise? If you see factors like monsoon, right, facilitated easy movement based on seasonality from India to Southeast Asia, from Southeast Asia to India. So what we see is, we have examples of ancient flow of trade. So for example, in Odisha, anyone from Odisha? There is a festival called Bali Yatra. All right, every year there is a festival called Bali Yatra which is celebrated in Odisha. ये किस बारे में? This commemorates the age-old tradition of trading ships setting sail towards Southeast Asia. Bali Yatra. All right. So trade is ancient, and with trade flow elements of culture. So elements of Hinduism as a civilizational stream, Buddhism, Islam, all civilizational streams traveled from India to Southeast Asia. All right, traveled from India to Southeast Asia. So you will see this in the context of the influence of Chola Empire in this region. You will see reference to empires like Champa. सुना है आपने चंपा? राइट, चंपा सुना है एंशिएंट हिस्ट्री में? नहीं सुना है, कोई बात नहीं. चंपा बेसिकली इज अ किंगडम दैट was ruled by Indian rulers in this particular region, largely जिसको हम आज इंडो चाइना कहते हैं. the region comprising areas of Vietnam, Cambodia, mainly Cambodia. इसीलिए आपको कंबोडिया में क्या मिलेगा? Angkor Wat. All right, that's one example, right? Similarly, you will see today Indonesia is a Muslim majority country, but if you look at its national emblem, emblem of its national carrier? It's Garuna, which is a mythological bird in Indian tradition. Similarly, Indonesia has a significant tradition of the staging of Ramayana, right? रामायण का बहुत सारा ट्रेडिशन है इस देश में और आसपास भी. Indonesia also has that particular tradition, right? And then you will find in architecture, in food, in all walks of life, there are similarities between India and Southeast Asia, right? So ये culture and civilization का flow है. अब generally if you see, this is what creates a special image of India in Southeast Asia, cultural similarity. पर ऐसा नहीं है कि केवल इंडियन कल्चर है वहाँ पे. Southeast Asia has its own indigenous elements of culture. B, another stream of culture has flown from China. C, another stream of culture has flown from India. And that is because Southeast Asia is right in the middle of the cross flow between countries, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. So that is why this region is fascinating. It has a fusion of various cultures. Now if we see in modern history terms, British rule created another basis of connect. British rule. So for example, the Britishers established trading posts like Singapore, all right? And generally you will see 8% of Singapore's population is of Indian origin, including the foreign minister of Singapore currently is of Indian origin. 3 of the former presidents of Singapore have been of Indian origin. So Singapore was established by the British when the Britishers were controlling India, and they established Singapore as a trading post right at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. And they also, Indians went to Singapore as traders or to work in British offices, and Indians also went to places like Malaysia. So again 8 to 9% of population of Malaysia is of Indian origin, all right? 8 to 9% of population of Malaysia is also of Indian origin. Tamil as a spoken language. So Britishers took Indians as indentured workers. And then you have a much closer country, for example Myanmar. Around 2 million people of Indian origin, 2 million people of Indian origin live in Myanmar, all right? And if you would remember from history, till 1935, Myanmar and India were part of the same administrative unit under the Britishers. Britishers ruled India and Myanmar together till 1935. After 1935, in exactly 1937, Myanmar and India were separated as administrative units, right? Britishers ruled India and Myanmar together. So you see, even in terms of British rule, you will find flow of people. So in Singapore, Indians are in large number. Indian culture is an important stream of culture in Singapore. In Malaysia also, Indians are a significant minority. In Myanmar also, there is large number of people. There are large number of people of Indian origin. And if you see, flow of Buddhist tourists from countries like Thailand, from countries like Myanmar, is a special feature of this relationship. So that's basically the element, from the element of culture and civilization from the ancient to the modern. Now if we see in terms of development of this relationship, right? Let's have a simple idea of development of this relationship. So we can see after the British period, in the Cold War era, cultural and civilizational linkages remained. India enjoyed a positive image in this region, but orientation changed. What orientation changed? While India went on the path of non-alignment, some countries of Southeast Asia like Indonesia, some countries of Southeast Asia like Indonesia became part of non-aligned movement which started in 1961. So there is some similarity in terms of political and foreign policy orientation, but largely you will see Southeast Asia fell under the umbrella of SEATO. Largely this region became dominated by alliance politics in the Cold War period. So you will see cultural civilizational affinity is there, but political engagements are affected by foreign policy orientation. In the post-Cold War period, what happens in the post-Cold War period? Now what you see is ASEAN is witnessing a period of focus on regional integration. ASEAN was created in the year 1967, if you will remember, right? So regional integration under ASEAN has led to the emergence of ASEAN as an attractive economy, and India is undergoing the process of trade liberalization. All right. So when you are liberalizing your trade, you would ideally like to find newer partners. And you see, there are other factors also which are propelling India to open up. For example, you have the collapse of Soviet Union, which means India lost an important international partner strategically as well as economically, and then domestic crisis, economic crisis. So these factors led to more liberalization in India. More liberalization in India required India to look at preferred trading partners, and ASEAN emerged as an automatic choice because A, India had enjoyed cultural affinity with this region, and B, this region had underwent a process of regional integration, and this regional integration had made this as an important economic bloc. So close to India, similarities and affinities, requirements. So that's why India then launches a Look East policy. Right? Look East policy more or less was launched in the year 1992. It focused on engagements with countries of South East Asia, all kinds of engagement. But if you see, effectively the focus was on economic engagements. All right, that was the focus, primarily economic engagements, right? Focusing on economic engagement. So thereby what you see, relations between these sides developed through, for example, India becoming a sectoral dialogue partner. India started a dialogue, sectoral dialogue partner. India became a sectoral dialogue partner of ASEAN in 1992. It started a dialogue, sectoral dialogue partner in one sector, which is trade. So this is the beginning. And then India gradually becomes a full dialogue partner. And then in 2002, India and ASEAN start their summit level engagement, India ASEAN summit. They started engaging at the level of summits, right? So this is something that is happening. So you see, partnership is growing. And then partnership in 2012 grows, where these countries are celebrating 20 years of engagements, and they define each other as strategic partners. So the relationship is upgraded to strategic partnership level, right? And then 2017, they celebrated 25 years of engagements, right? So there was a commemorative summit in New Delhi. where all the leaders of ASEAN were invited, and we commemorated 25 years of engagement. So what is it that has happened in 25 years of engagement? We see India started as a sectoral dialogue partner, then India and ASEAN started a summit. So this is a regular feature of this meeting. 2012, India and ASEAN defined themselves to be strategic partners. So if we see that the Look East policy, which focused on relations with Southeast Asia, has laid the foundations of the modern day engagements. So what we find is, as we started engaging, trade grew from in 1992 from $3 billion to in 2002 to $12 billion. That is what we will see in terms of concrete progress. $3 billion to 2002, $12 billion of trade, right? 4 times increase in trade. And then we see gradually we started consolidating our relations. So we can see that different phases of Look East have been there. 2010, India and ASEAN signed a free trade agreement in goods. All right, free trade agreement in goods is signed, and then by 2014, a free trade agreement involving services and investments is signed. So that's where you would see trade engagements enhanced in this particular period. So we can clearly see that the era of Look East laid the foundations and also witnessed consolidation of this relationship, specifically in the economic arena, whereby you have increase in trade and whereby you have agreements like the free trade agreement in goods, which is signed. Now in 2014, the Prime Minister announced that the Look East now is Act East. So it is argued that Act East is action oriented and implementation oriented version of Act East, or action oriented, implementation oriented, maturity of Look East. So policy is the same, but now the focus is on implementation, right? Announcements which have been made should be quickly implemented. Then it expands the ambit of East. It expands the ambit of East in India's foreign policy. So now focus is still on Southeast Asia, but Act East means relations with countries beyond Southeast Asia are also important, like Japan, South Korea, or larger Pacific. So Act East brought another difference, that is now the definition of East goes beyond Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is still at the center of Act East, but the meaning of East is more than Southeast Asia, right? And thereby you will see there is also a greater focus on, in this era, greater focus on connectivity, technology, cultural initiatives, and apart from that, it is argued that in the era of Act East there is a greater focus on strategic issues. Strategic issues, for example, issues arising out of rise of China, right? That India is a neighbor of China. Southeast Asian countries are neighbors of China. They may have common experience, common concerns. They may see common challenges, but that needs to be identified, what they can do for each other. So there is greater focus on the strategic issues in the era of Act East. Yes, Ananya Das says Biju Patnaik of Odisha has also been conferred the Bhumi Putra Award of Indonesia, which is its highest civilian award. You know why? Because at that point in time when India became independent, Indonesia was going through an intense phase of decolonization, and Prime Minister Nehru had asked Mr. Biju Patnaik to fly to Indonesia, and at that point in time Indonesia had a leader, right? Sukarno, who was safeguarded by Biju Patnaik. So Biju Patnaik from Odisha, long-term Chief Minister of Odisha, had a special relation with Indonesia. So you are right there. Yes. Now, so what we have talked about is, we said that India's relations with Southeast Asia are relations based on culture, commerce and connectivity. ये कहा हमने, culture, commerce and connectivity. Let us go back and remind ourselves. So we said that this is the short-term formula that you can use to understand this relationship. But largely the relationship is based on cultural and civilizational linkages, which can be seen in the ancient times through the flow of trade, relations of Indian empires like Cholas with Southeast Asia, or flow of civilizational streams from Hinduism to Buddhism to Islam to Southeast Asia, the examples of which are also found today, right? Then we said that even if you come in history to modern times, you will find some elements of cultural engagements in the form of movement of people. So Britishers established Singapore, Indians moved to Singapore, and you would remember any phase of history. अभी हम लोग बात कर रहे हैं नेताजी के बारे में, all right? Netaji took over the leadership of INA in Singapore. यहाँ पे, that is in the history of Indian National Army, the Malay Peninsula is important जब history पढ़ोगे तो, all right? So in the British period also there are linkages. So we see that people moved to Singapore, became an important community in Singapore, including presidents in Singapore, ministers in Singapore have been of Indian origin. Malaysia, people from India moved, as became a significant minority there, significant community there. You have Myanmar, again large number of Indian origin people live and work there. So that is in the modern days. Now we see that that is a pillar of this relationship. Now if we move forward in the post-independence period, what do we see in this relationship? Cultural affinity, civilizational commonality remains the constant basis of engagement. But political orientation, strategic orientation, foreign policy orientation may differ, change. So Cold War period, you see in the Southeast Asian region, there are certain countries which have commonalities with India. For example, Indonesia is part of non-aligned movement. India is also part of non-aligned movement. But largely this region is dominated by great power politics. So for example, creation of CATO. So largely this region's orientation is towards US, all right? So that is where they are focusing. Cold War ends. After the Cold War, what we see? In Southeast Asia, there is fair degree of consolidation, regional integration under ASEAN. So it has emerged as an economic bloc. India, on the other hand, is looking for diversification of its trade relations because it faced domestic crisis, liquidity crisis or balance of payment crisis. Collapse of Soviet Union means that there is no rupee-ruble trade and an important trading partner is lost. So India is searching for a new trading partner. India opens up in terms of trade also. So then Southeast Asia emerges as a obvious choice of partner. Why? Because we have cultural affinity with them and they are also now emerging as an important economic bloc and they are geographically closer to us. So then we have seen the emergence of Look East policy. Look East policy emerged in 1992, focused on relations or engagements with Southeast Asia. Primary focus was on economy. So we started as a sectoral dialogue partner, if you will remember, in 1992. फिर क्या हुआ? This relationship grew. In 2002, what did we start? Summit level interactions with ASEAN. And then by 2012, we further upgraded our relationship and we said that we are strategic partners. Right? And in 2017, we celebrated 25 years of this modern day relation under largely Look East. So we see some visible changes in this relationship also. What? From the starting of dialogue partnership in 1992 to 2002, the first decade, we see increase in trade with Southeast Asia increases from 3 billion US dollars to 12 billion US dollars. Similarly, we see now in the second decade of Look East, which is from 2002 to 2012, we have intensification of relations by signing of agreements. For example, free trade agreement in goods in 2010, and of course strategic partnership in 2012. You remember this? And then what happens is by 2014 the relationship further intensifies, the process continues, we sign a free trade agreement in services. 2014 there is a change in government, so the new government then says that our Look East would now be Act East, meaning we are saying that a focus on Southeast Asia continues, but now the focus would more be on implementation and then deepening of relationship, consolidation of relationship. So focus on economy continues, but there is also one meaning that Act East acquires, that it opens up the scope of East. So Southeast Asia is at the center of India's looking at East or acting at East, but East does not necessarily mean Southeast Asia only. So now in the era of Act East, the relations are also relations with Japan, relations with South Korea, relations with other countries. So we are then focusing on economy, we are expanding our engagements, we are then also saying that we will be focusing on connectivity, new and emerging areas, technology, cultural initiatives would continue, and we are saying that there would be greater focus on strategic issues in this region, like how do we respond to rise of China, not only counter it, but how do we generally respond to it. And then we see intensification of regional cooperation, not only through ASEAN but also other initiatives like BIMSTEC, Mekong, Ganga cooperation, and then you will see further forms of cooperation growing in this particular region in the era of Act East. So a brief snapshot of this relationship. Now let's see important areas of engagement as we had talked about, right? We have covered the history. If you have any doubts, you can ask the question. But now let's look at the relation in terms of major areas of engagement. What is the major area of engagement that we had identified? Culture, civilization, समझ में आ गया. Now let's look at economic engagements. So you already understand that trade with ASEAN countries has witnessed growth. This is undeniable. If you look at the period of 1992 to 2002, the trade grew by 4 times. All right. If you look at the figure for 2021-22, the trade right now is 98 billion US dollars, 98 billion US dollars of trade, expansion in trade. And then there has been consolidation of trade relations by free trade agreements. Free trade agreements signal the consolidation of these relations. However, in the area of economic engagements, while this is true, our concerns have focused on a continuing trade deficit. So trade deficit has also persisted, and then we see that another consistent focus of India has been lack of progress in services. That services agreement has not seen as much progress as we would have liked to. So these two remain important elements of economic engagements. What? That we would never forget that trade has expanded. ASEAN remains an important trading bloc for India, right? We see that trade engagements have been consolidated by trade agreements as well. We have free trade agreements with ASEAN, but we also see that our general concerns have been a trade deficit with ASEAN and also lack of progress in services, right? So our manufacturers would say that the trade agreement has benefited more ASEAN because they have been able to expand their exports more as compared to Indian companies, right? And then simultaneously a benefit that we expected in services. Generally, India seeks greater liberalization of services trade in terms of movement of natural persons. All right, we see that those benefits have also not accrued. We will always remember trade in services has remained an area of contention globally. People have agreed more readily to expansion of trade in terms of movement of goods, movement of capital. They have been liberalized to a large extent. Movement of goods, movement of capital, but not movement of people. All right. So जब हम कहते हैं trade liberalization has taken place, जब हम कहते हैं globe has become interconnected, we see this in the case of goods and in terms of capital. ये flow आसान हो गया है, but the flow of people, flow of labor has not become any easier. So that is generally what you will see would be India's contention with any of the major trading partners. With Europe, what do we want? With Europe also we want liberalization of trade in services, mainly focusing on ease of movement of professionals. All right, with US also we focus on ease of movement of professionals. So here also we see we are not satisfied with progress in services. And then what we see is another issue which may have arisen is in the context of RCEP. India is not a part of RCEP, meaning so far we expanded trade, we consolidated trade relations by signing trade agreements. We see some trade issues have persisted, but now we see that the next era of trade liberalization through regional trade agreements like RCEP do not include India. So in certain ways the relationship is stuck economically in the previous era, where older issues persist, where newer progress like progress in the area of RCEP is still to include India. So thereby, how do we resolve this? India has made a demand for the review of FTAs with ASEAN. And generally, India and ASEAN are exploring the modalities of this trade agreement review. So this is already part of the agenda, this is already happening. How do we address issues of trade deficit or lack of progress in services? By reviewing bilateral arrangements, right? So that is what is happening right now, review of free trade agreement. And then what we see is RCEP is not a closed chapter. What we find is most of the South East Asian economies want India to be a part of RCEP. So that means that we need to find ways in which our interests are safeguarded and we can take advantage of RCEP. It's not a closed chapter by any means. We said that RCEP in its final form does not reflect its original spirit, does not adequately safeguard India's interests, so we would not be signing. But that does not mean that other countries don't want us there. The possibility is there. We may negotiate the possibility of joining the RCEP in the future. So that is there. And currently this is what our understanding is in the matters of trade, this is something that is happening, right? So once we understand this, we need to understand the RCEP. What is the RCEP, right? Let's understand the RCEP in simple terms. So when we talk about RCEP, the negotiations started in the year 2012. 2012, the ASEAN proposed a free trade agreement involving its free trade partners. So it involved negotiations between 10 plus 6 countries. Which are these 6 countries? 6 free trade partners of ASEAN. Who are those? Let's start with India, then Australia, then China, then Japan, then South Korea, and let's say New Zealand. So these countries started negotiating with each other for a regional trade agreement, which is also referred to as mega free trade agreement because of the nature of involvement of 16 countries. So it was called a mega regional free trade agreement, a large regional free trade agreement, right? So generally, if you see, it involved negotiations on wide variety of issues in trade. So not only goods and services, but also factors like rules of origin, factors like labor, environment, dispute resolution. So that's why it was a major agreement which was to be negotiated, a comprehensive one. Not only reduction of tariff in goods and services, but also factors like rules of origin, customs rules, labor standards, environmental standards, dispute resolution. So that's why it was comprehensive. And generally understand, when we say economic partnership, RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or when we say CEPA, these are generally FTA plus, right? Because in simple terms, in very simple terms, FTAs, when they started, they were instruments for trade liberalization, and initially they focused on liberalization through reduction in tariffs. So that was the preferred formula of free trade agreements when they started, right? Trade liberalization, how do you liberalize trade? By reduction in tariffs, right? And then gradually FTAs have evolved. So FTAs now have taken the form of these mega regional trade agreements or comprehensive economic partnership agreements, just as India signs. So FTA component is there in terms of there would be provision for reduction of tariffs, abolition of tariffs. But FTA plus in terms of inclusion of comprehensive packages, right? So not only goods but also services, not only tariffs but also rules, right? Not only simple matters of trade but also now standards of labor, standards of environment, matters of competition. So धीरे धीरे ऐसे FTAs का evolution हुआ है, right? In very simple terms, this is how you can understand it, that early FTAs were about liberalization of trade by reduction of tariffs, right? And then gradually FTAs expanded their ambit to include other areas. For example, initial FTAs were about goods. Later FTAs started including services and investments. And now we are talking about these major agreements, mega agreements, which not only includes these traditional concerns, but also they may include provisions on wide variety of issues. So that's why this was a comprehensive agreement. Now if you look at its significance, it aimed to create one of the largest free trade areas in the world. So that's why it was significant, because of its magnitude. If you see a free trade area in which there are countries of ASEAN involved, but there is also an economy of the size of India, economy of the size of China, economy of the size of Japan. So by trade value or by the combined size of their GDPs, it would have become world's largest free trade area. That is what they had aimed. It was ambitious. And then if you look at the region, you also find that it would have created world's largest market. World's largest market. In what sense? If you have market of India, which is around what? क्या population है हमारी? At that point in time 1.2 billion. All right. Now add to it market of China. What is the population of China? At that point in time around 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion. अब यही दो ऐड कर दिया तो ये बन गया दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा market. Now but you also have Southeast Asia, more than 650 million people living here. So it would have created world's largest market as well, common market, bound by one free trade agreement. And then you generally see it came in the context of what was happening globally. Globally there was a logjam at WTO. WTO, which is considered to be global trade body responsible for ensuring trade liberalization through agreements between countries or promotion of certain principles, was not seeing any progress. So there was a priority of countries. Countries either liked free trade agreements bilaterally, or countries started moving away to regional trade agreement. Sharanveer says, sir, if India is not part of RCEP, then why you have included India in those 6 countries? So Sharanveer, please focus. I said it started as a negotiation, right, in 2012. So I'm talking about 2012 when it was a negotiation. RCEP was a negotiation that started in 2012. So it was proposed. What was it proposed to be? It was proposed to be a free trade agreement involving 6 free trade partners of ASEAN, right? So that is what I am talking about, and then we will come to when India decides not to sign it, right? Right now we are talking about the significance of it. So logjam at WTO meant globally there was a setback to trade liberalization, right? So generally अभी हम लोग क्या सुनते हैं, deglobalization सुना है आपने, right? और backlash against globalization is happening, ये सुना है आपने. तो इसका मतलब है कभी globalization का peak भी रहा होगा. So we think 1990s, early 2000s, this is where there was a greater focus on trade liberalization. इंडिया ने बहुत सारे ट्रेड एग्रीमेंट इस समय साइन किए. ग्लोबली यही हो रहा था. We had hoped that WTO would promote trade liberalization, but gradually we understood that ultimately WTO is not being able to make progress because countries prefer to address their issues on their own. So when globally there was a setback to globalization, trade liberalization, this RCEP represented an example, a large example of a large number of countries coming together for the purpose of promoting trade liberalization. ऐसे समझ सकते हैं आप that in the context of logjam at WTO, RCEP took forward the goal of trade liberalization. So it normatively also it was important. At that point in time it was one of the most important agreements which was being negotiated. And then you can add to it that US had a similar agreement that it had proposed, but US withdrew from TPP in 2016. So at that point in time, if you see, RCEP was being negotiated, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, was being negotiated. These are large trade agreements, all right? And then there was also a proposed Transatlantic Trade Partnership, US and Europe Union. They were negotiating these kinds of regional trade agreements. But gradually, the only trade agreement that made progress was RCEP. US withdrew from TPP, its effectiveness ended there, right? So at that point in time, RCEP represented the most significant trade negotiation in the context of logjam at WTO to take forward the process of trade liberalization, right? So these are the factors why India was participating in RCEP. We will stop here. In the next class, we will start from here. So you understand now, there should be no confusion. Right now, we are only talking about what the RCEP aimed to be. क्या था ये? और हम कल बात करेंगे किस बारे में? कल नहीं है, अगली क्लास में. Don't take it literally. अगली क्लास में जब भी हम मिलेंगे, we will talk about RCEP and beyond. What happened and why India did not sign, right?